Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I want to talk with you guys about a topic that you don't see people actually discuss the real thing that's going on here, but people always talk about this in fitness circles and bodybuilding circles, and I got in a conversation yesterday with someone in my comments about this, and I remember a bodybuilder that I know on his social media talking about this the other day, and that's this idea that people get that when you eat too many carbs as someone who's athletic and trains, that somehow you become insulin resistant, that you start developing insulin resistance from eating too many carbohydrates. And the problem we run into with this theory is that you'll see bodybuilders saying this, I'm like, yeah, and I got my blood work done and my fasting glucose was really high. And so they'll give advice to other people, but they need to understand this is advice that natties do not need to worry about. It's literally not something that someone who doesn't use drugs and doesn't compete in bodybuilding needs to ever be concerned with. The problem we have is that you have all these bodybuilders telling people this as if this is actually a real concern. Guys, let me clue you in on this. Starches, other than maybe excessive amounts of fructose, which isn't a starch, starchy carbs in no amount reduce insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue in people who train vigorously. All right, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Now, excessive fructose intake for prolonged periods of time or excessive saturated fat intake for prolonged periods of time can do that, particularly in a calorie surplus. But for people who are eating a relatively low-fat diet, it doesn't even have to be a really low-fat diet, fairly low-fat diet, and you're not eating a lot of refined sugars, this doesn't happen. You don't develop insulin resistance to the point to where it becomes a concern. And that's the thing, you know, I've seen bodybuilders talking about this and they'll be like, well, I got my blood work done and my fasting glucose is really high. And so they'll give advice to everybody based around this, but what they don't want to tell people, and this is the problem we run into with social media, YouTube, wherever else these people are saying this, they're not explaining to them the real reason that's happening. I'm going to let people think on that one for a bit before I explain why. So why would that happen? Because that doesn't happen in athletes. The only people who seem to struggle with this seem to be bodybuilders. It doesn't happen to athletes. Most serious athletes who are well conditioned can eat enormous, mind-boggling amounts of carbohydrates, and they have amazing fasting blood glucose. Amazing. They don't have this problem. And people, even the ones who are using anabolics, don't have this problem. So why do you think it is that they're developing this? It's the insulin they're using. It's guys out there who are using insulin to get big as part of their drug stack. They're using all this insulin, and then what happens? They start to develop insulin resistance because they're using huge amounts of insulin with large amounts of carbohydrates, and all that insulin they're pinning is doing it. Now they start having problems with insulin sensitivity over time during their bulk. It's not the carbohydrates doing it, because the truth is, if you're doing plenty of cardio and therefore you have good conditioning and you are strength training, to the point to where you have enough progressive overload that you are gaining muscle, I can assure you that your insulin sensitivity is not reducing just because you're clean bulking. Just because you eat a very large amount of carbohydrates that you are burning through and gaining weight very slowly, you're not going to see reduction in insulin sensitivity in your muscle tissue. All training increases insulin sensitivity in your muscle tissue. And in fact, people who are training and burning through enormous amounts of energy because they do a lot of training and a lot of exercise, their insulin sensitivity improves, and therefore their body produces less of it. They produce far less of it because they don't need as much. They maintain a good level of insulin sensitivity. They don't develop resistance to it. They don't develop these problems with carbohydrates. And all the people you see who are saying, hey, I developed this problem, it's the drugs you're using. It's the drugs you're using that are causing it. And some of them are like, well, I'm not using insulin. And then you say, well, what are you using? You found out they're using a lot of IGF-1. Well, IGF-1 is an insulin-like growth factor. It mimics insulin in certain ways, and I have seen guys who use a lot of that start to run into these problems. But here's the issue we run into. You'll see bodybuilders talking about this, and they're giving this advice to other bodybuilders. And then the laymen, people who just work out, people who are trying to train serious and gain muscle and care about their body composition and everything else, see this and they pick up on it. And they say, oh, this is a problem. They're saying, oh, it's all these carbs they're eating. It's not the carbs they're eating that are causing it. They have to eat the carbs because of all the other stuff they're pinning that requires them to. The carbohydrates are not the problem. We just don't have documented cases in scientific literature and in studies or looking at the metabolic ward. You don't see athletic people eating so many carbohydrates. It's a very high carb diet if it's low in everything else. A very high carbohydrate diet doesn't cause this. In fact, what have we seen in certain situations? You've seen medical doctors pretty much cure type 2 diabetes on people running almost all starch diets. I mean, look at people like Dr. McDougall. He has cured hundreds of cases of type 2 diabetes by putting people on starch-based diets. Meaning 70-80% of their calories are coming from starches. Starches are complex carbohydrates. Their diabetes is actually cured. Have them do some basic exercise and go on a diet like that. That sort of diet reduces this problem. It eventually over time helps your body handle this stuff better. It promotes insulin sensitivity. Weight training promotes insulin sensitivity. Cardio promotes insulin sensitivity. So in what world is it biologically possible that eating too many carbohydrates, when we're talking about primarily whole food sources, not talking about table sugar, we're not talking about this dextrose and this crap people are taking post-workout, we're talking about food. In no world does someone who lifts weights and does cardio lose insulin sensitivity or start to become insulin insensitive from eating too many whole food carb sources. It doesn't happen in the real world. It doesn't happen in scientific studies. It doesn't happen in athletic populations, and it doesn't happen in people who medical doctors are working with trying to cure their problems with their blood sugar and everything. It only happens to bodybuilders. And the reason it only happens to bodybuilders is because the training and the food isn't the problem. It's all the other stuff they're putting in their body with it while bulking and gaining weight and gaining body fat. And I'm not saying that if you went on a really dirty bulk and you gained 20 pounds in 5 weeks that you might not start to see some problems with your blood sugar and everything else. But if that's usually because you're eating a lot of fat and you're gaining a lot of weight. For people who are gaining weight slowly, gaining mostly muscle and only a little bit of fat, who are eating very high starch diets or even diets high in fruit, in which they are getting not large amounts of fat and not large amounts of refined sugars or anything, they very rarely see any negative or measurable changes in things like your fasting blood glucose. We don't see these problems. This is a problem limited almost exclusively to either the bodybuilder world or people who dirty bulk to the point to where they are gaining 30 or 40 or 50 pounds of body fat. You put in that environment, that can happen, but it's not the carbs that are causing it. It's your total caloric intake, your total fat intake, your total weight gain. That's what's causing it. It's not the carbs that are the problem. That's a whole plethora of problems. But out of all the macronutrients out there, carbohydrates, particularly ones that aren't really, really high in fructose, don't significantly contribute to insulin resistance. They just don't. In fact, that sort of diet is a proven method to cure type 2 diabetes. So again, this is a problem limited primarily to the bodybuilding world, and it is because of the various drugs that they choose to utilize to put on the type of size these guys are trying to put on. Because a lot of these guys, again, you'd be surprised what a lot of these guys have to put in their body to reach the size they're reaching. It's oftentimes a lot more than people realize it is. Again, Rich Piana gave you guys a real good example in that blast he did less than a year before he passed away. I give you guys a real good idea. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.